first of all, I should make one small note. So in my head, I misremembered the title of this talk. Rather than how to make the right decision, I conceived of it as how to make better decisions. And I suppose I'd like to kind of work with that in mind, because I think it's a bit hubristic of me to try to imagine telling you how to make the right decision, all things considered. Instead, what I just want to do is kind of call attention to some of the things that can go awry when we actually try to make decisions, and kind of bring that to your awareness. So what I'd like to do as a way of beginning with this is, first of all, I would like you to begin looking at the first question in the poll that hopefully you're presented with, which is, what factors actually contribute to making a good decision? And if you can think about possible factors that contribute to making a good decision, if you could just type in a couple of some free association, type in a word or two that come to mind about factors that contribute to making a good decision. Then what I'd like to do is actually go about constructing a word cloud based on your responses. And if this is working, hopefully we can actually now start seeing the things that people think contribute to making a good decision. Okay, fantastic. So now we're beginning to kind of crowdsource this. And so, okay, so evidence, goals, good, those are the things that are kind of coming to most people's attention. And then there are a lot of other aspects: good information, intuition, vision, empathy, all right, experience, research, fantastic. Okay, so now there are some things here that I want to already call attention to. So information and evidence and intuition, those are really important factors. And what I want to do in this talk is actually concentrate on some ways in which the evidence and information that we're presented with can interact with our intuitions in ways that seem actually, oddly enough, counterintuitive. So that way, when you think about how to deal with the information you're presented, if you aren't careful, you can actually end up making poor decisions, or at least not the right decision in terms of being able to process that information. So if some of you are familiar with the work in decision theory or psychology that people have talked about regarding bias and these decision issues, you may have seen one or two of the things I'm going to talk about. But I am also going to talk about some things from experimental philosophy and from work by Percy Diaconis, who's a mathematician who studied coincidences. So I hope that there will be something new here for absolutely everyone. Okay, now having thought about what factors make good decisions, let me now turn to the next item in the poll, which is what can get in the way of making a good decisions. Okay, here we see responses: muddled thinking, emotions, various variables that you haven't tried to control for, narrow mindset, biases, and so on, fear, clarity. Okay, these are all very good points, and I'm going to come back to some of these themes as well, particularly clarity, because not being clear about what is the precise question that's being asked can often lead to poor decisions. Okay, so with that, now let me turn to the the next aspect of the talk. So this is what I want to cover. So I want to begin with a very brief introduction on decisions, and then look at some areas where our standard intuitions can go awry. And these will break down into 5 different areas, and then I want to just close with some remarks about where you can go for further reading or further information on decision making if you're interested. Okay, so to begin with, so I think one of the things that's really fascinating about making decisions and how people have studied making decisions is that effectively, since the very beginnings of philosophy and the natural sciences, the standard conception of human decision makers has been this highly idealized, perfectly rational decision maker. And so right there I've got a photograph of the bronze bust of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, art, and commerce. And it's this highly idealized rational agent that's always been seen as the core of how we think about decision making. But through the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and a whole host of other people, we now know that there are a whole host of different kinds of biases and aspects to our thinking which can get in the way of how we process information and can actually lead us astray in how we make decisions, both in terms of conscious bias and statistical bias, and also ways in which our brains can kind of leap to conclusions in ways that we are not always aware of. What I want to do now is actually kind of go through and explore some of these. Okay, so to begin, base rate basics. Let me begin with a story, or just a kind of a thought experiment. So think about medical testing. Right? This is going to be just a kind of a case study, but once I talk through this, hopefully you can see how it will easily generalize to a lot of other cases that you'll be familiar with. Okay, so suppose that you're going to the doctor and you need to take a medical test that is pretty accurate, but of course no test is perfectly accurate all of the time, right? So suppose this medical test for some condition will mistakenly identify a healthy person as having the disease 5% of the time. But let's suppose that this test at least has the benefit that it will never fail to identify an unhealthy person. Okay? So if that's the case, now suppose that we've got a group of 10,000 people, and what you know about that 10,000 people is that 2% of them have the disease. Okay, so suppose this is just part of your background knowledge. Okay, now you go to your doctor, they do the test, and then you find out that you get a positive result. Now the question I want to ask is, what is the probability of having the disease given a positive test result? Okay, so now if you can just think about that for a moment, what's the probability of having the disease given a positive test result? Just think about this. Okay, so what are some people saying? So some people say 95%, 5%, 2%, 2 out of 7. Okay, so what else do people think? Okay, so depends on the pretest probability. Okay, so good point. So in the terms of the pretest probability, you know that 2% of the population has the disease. The test never incorrectly identifies someone with the disease, but it does incorrectly identify healthy people 5% of the time. That's all the information you need to know. Okay, fantastic. So this, I think, nicely highlights the point about base rates. I think many people have said 90% of the time, 95% of the time, and so on. So I think you might be surprised. Okay, so this graphic over here on the right, so it's a bunch of dots. Don't bother counting them. I can promise you that there are 10,000 dots there, 1 dot for each person in the population. Okay, now what we know is that 2% of the population have the disease. So that's 200 people. We know that 2% have that, and we know that the test is never wrong. So the test will always identify those people as having the disease. That's what this little green 2 rows at the bottom is about. Those are the people that the test gives a positive result for. But we know that everyone who doesn't have the disease, so that is all of the other gray dots here are healthy, but we know that the test is wrong 5% of the time for those people. So 5% of those people will get the positive test result. So those are the red dots down there. So when you say, what's the chance that you've got the disease given a positive test result, what you have to look about is, well, how many people is the positive result correct for versus the total population who get the positive test result. And that's 200 divided by 200 plus 490, 29%. So the thing that's important about this is that in cases where the base rate, the 2% of the population, is very low, your intuitions about what the meaning of a positive test is can be really quite misleading.